We're about to witness the greatest miracle of the machine age.
The Gentle Rebel Podcast.
I'm so glad you could come. This is going to be such an exciting day. I hope you enjoy it. I think you will.
Hello, how you doing? Welcome to the Gentle Rebel Podcast. I'm Andy, somewhat nomadic songwriter and slow coach, and I love exploring the intersection of high sensitivity, creativity, and the relationship that we have with the cultures that emerge within, around, and between us. In this episode, we're going back to basics. This was our most recent phrase maze prompt in the Haven as we explored the words in this phrase from different angles, sort of picked them apart and prodded and poked at them a little bit together in a Haven gathering. And I want to focus on the idea of going back and what it means to go back to basics, to go back to the heart of things. And is it even possible to go back when time only moves in one direction? Going back can be appealing, can't it? Especially when we think of it as returning somewhere safe, somewhere familiar, especially when things feel complex and messy and beyond our understanding, in the present. We might sort of picture how things were and yearn for a kind of simplistic image of times gone by, glossing over the complexity and the messiness of that time, of the past, and extracting nostalgia, which is kind of the residue of this re-perceived memory, a rose-tinted, perfected representation or perception of how things were before the challenges of today took their hold on us and on the world around us. Nostalgia is a powerful force, isn't it? It gets talked about quite a lot. It's often tied to this idea of going back or thinking back, like yearning for this time when things were simpler, safer, more attuned to a purer sense of being, those kinds of things. And I really like the description of nostalgia as utopia in reverse. So it's like a vision of a perfect past, shadowed by whatever antagonist it is that we feel plaguing the present. It might be a person or a job or a situation, a political shift, something in our own circumstances that sort of cast a shadow that this nostalgic picture of the past kind of sits in. And so the memory of that takes on a glow in our mind, not because it was truly perfect in any sense, but because it stands in contrast with what it is that we're experiencing now under the conditions that are present in our lives. And it creates this oppositional perception that purifies the past and demonizes these aspects of the present. And so this is the same as this sort of future utopian thinking, where an imagined future is built on the idea that we can get there if we can eradicate some problem or some antagonist or some oppositional force that exists in the present. So, utopia is shaped by the shadow of this oppositional force, and as such only really exists because of that. So the utopia is the shadow of the thing that, feels like an obstacle right now. And so this kind of utopic nostalgia relies on the belief in a lost object, which was never really there to begin with in a substantive sense. It was never tangibly in existence. Like you'd go back to that time and actually it doesn't exist in the way that our memory or our perception of that time would tell us it does. So it's kind of like what Jacques Lacan called objet petit a, the object cause of desire. So in other words, a desire sustained by the lack of its fulfillment. And so the lack of the thing itself is what creates the desire for it. And so acquiring the object that we think sort of holds the solution to our desire doesn't actually give us what we think we want. There's always that sort of future missing aspect, the sense of disappointment that comes. Yeah, this objet is the shadow of the object that we desire to acquire or destroy. It's the element that we would realize is still present in its absence, even if we were picked up and plonked in the heart of our nostalgic or utopian fantasy, whether they're kind of returning to a point in the past or being thrust forward to a point in the future where we've got rid of that thing that we think is the cause of our dissatisfaction or our sense of incompleteness. And so it's easy to see how this plays out in rhetoric. Words like back, again, rediscover. These sorts of things can have an almost magical pull to them. Take back control, make our country great again, reclaim our strength. And so these kinds of phrases are powerful because they suggest that they have implicit in them this idea that the past holds something true and precious that we've lost, something that we once had, and it's ours to fight, to get back, to reclaim. And within this is an implicit antagonist, something, some force or some person or some group that has deliberately and intentionally sort of taken this away from us, this nefarious force that has made the present worse than the past, or something that is making the present, or it's an obstacle to the future that could be possible if it wasn't there. And so it creates this division between where we are and where we imagine we could be, whether it is getting back to a point in the past or moving on to a point in the future that is currently impossible because of this obstacle. And so what happens when we strip away those nostalgic trigger words? So instead of take back control, what we might say sort of take control. Instead of make America great again, we might say make America great. And to some extent, the focus shifts from identifying and destroying enemies, the things, the forces, the people that have stolen control and stolen greatness, which are, two slippery concepts that mean nothing and anything that we want them to. And instead to open a conversation to make a sort of radically new future possible as we tarry with it together. It's about starting where we are, who we are, the people that are here, with what we have, imagining what could come next. And so it's not a retreat back to basics, back to this point in the past, but it's a step forwards, kind of through a truly political process, not as oppositional forces, but as people coming together from different persuasions, different backgrounds, to envision and to tarry with and to figure out a positive vision that works in some kind of imperfect way, which is, really the definition of democracy. It's this very fragile state of being that relies on this sense of everyone buying into it and leaving something of themselves behind and realizing, okay, this is not going to be perfect, but it's the best that we can do. And this shift helps us manage the tension of longing for basics without falling into that trap of turning that contradiction into an oppositional position, of creating enemies out of people who disagree with us or don't see the world in the same way as us or come from different backgrounds to us. It invites us to explore how to reconcile differing beliefs and values without turning those whose values and beliefs differ to ours into enemies. And we can apply this stuff as well to ourselves and to the stories that we tell ourselves about what is holding us back from getting to where we want to go. The things that we want for our own lives. We might yearn for days gone by, or imagine that there's this sort of perfect time ahead if only we could get rid of the obstacle that is stopping us from getting there. Nostalgia might lead to a victim sort of mindset, something that has been taken from us that we can't get back. So I can't, that point in the past where things were better, I can't return there because it's been taken from me. And utopianism can lead to an oppressive mindset as well. I must defeat the forces that are trying to stop me from getting to where I want to go. Sort of competitive mindset that says these people are, or these forces are trying to stop me from having what I am entitled to. And this might be an external battle with particular people, with particular problems, situations, things that emerge culturally or in the world around us. And they cast the shadow of our utopian vision for our own lives. Or it might be an internal battle where we see our own thoughts and our own feelings as problems, as enemies to squash, to defeat, to fight against. We might talk about what we perceive our younger self to have been capable of. And I do this all the time. Like, it's one of the magical things about journaling, actually, is the perception of, I might listen back to some music that I've made in the past, or just think back to old memories and things that I've done, and be like, oh, yeah, I wish I had the confidence and the discipline and the creative freedom my younger self had. But realizing through journaling that that's a perception. My journal actually tells me that even that past version of me that seemed to create freely was full of doubt, full of anxiety and fear in relation to all of that sort of stuff. And I would write about the things that I would do once I, got over certain obstacles and learn new things. And then I realize now, looking back, it's like, oh, I've done that. I've achieved that. I've got there. And yet those things still persist. The perception I have of the past me that wrote and recorded those songs in my back catalogue isn't true. And the belief my past self had in the idea that, once I got to a certain place in the future, I would be more whole and complete, weren't true. And we're so, forever in this state of being divided in that sense. And that is where life's meaning and beauty come from. It's why art exists. It's why we create things. It's why we form relationships with other human beings. These things aren't answers to the perpetual state of being slightly out of whack with ourselves. They're not like gonna make us whole and complete. They're not that at all. They're the product of that state of being. And I think this is the truth to come back to sort of jettison those thoughts of utopian nostalgia, the thoughts that we need to get back to this place of purity that we once had, didn't exist, or that we need to get to this place of utopian purity in the future that we have in our minds, that is this place, this kind of promised land in the future where everything is perfect, everything is whole and complete, and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, yeah, that is the pathway to tyranny. It's the pathway to sort of totalitarianism. This here, this now, this is all we have. And we can do a lot with this.
You can't get out backwards. You've got to go forwards to go back. Better press out.
This is a football, the coach reminded the team. It starts and ends here. So I scribbled this haiku, clumsy haiku, before our phrase maze discussion. And after reading the story of Vince Lombardi, the legendary coach of the Green Bay Packers, who at the start of their training camp in 1961, following a terrible championship loss the previous season, he stood there in front of the players and began with these simple words. This is a football. So rather than dissecting all the things that went wrong the previous season and strategizing, okay, this is what we're going to do to put right those mistakes, Lombardi took his team back to the very, very basics. And his message was clear. Before building the new tactics, before building strategies for the season ahead, we need to rebuild the foundations. We need to start from scratch. Learning, relearning, unlearning, a rhythm that never ends as we move forwards in almost any situation. This sort of sense of coming back to the basics and reminding ourselves why we do what we do, why we care about what we do, what actually matters, what this is all about, and what we might need to let go so that we can make space to actually see the heart of things again, to see the football. And this kind of links to a really interesting concept I heard Lucy Easthope talk about on a podcast recently, which is isomorphic learning in the context of disaster recovery and planning, of which Lucy is one of the UK's leading experts. And she describes this idea, isomorphic learning, as distilling core lessons from past crises. And she points out that, so often we prepare for the previous crisis. And in so doing, don't adequately get ready for the unpredictability and those uncertain elements of what is going to come next. Disasters by their nature are chaotic and don't repeat themselves in the same way. Even if she talked about flooding, and somewhere might flood and then it will flood again, but the flood will happen in different ways. There'll be different challenges. And so if you prepare for what happened last time, you're unlikely to be prepared for the unexpected, unpredictable things that will happen next time. And so this is where this isomorphic learning comes in. So instead of focusing on the specifics of what went wrong before and fixating on really particular aspects of it, it's about identifying universal principles and patterns, these lessons that apply across contexts. And like Lombardi's approach, going back to the basics, building the foundations for the future from that point. And so if we think about it, after a crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or a professional setback or a personal failure or something, we tend to focus on what we think we could have done differently in that specific situation, and then maybe sort of integrate that into what we carry forwards, as I'm not going to let that happen again in that same way. But this can lead to sort of what people might describe as like fighting the last war, where all our energy goes into solving yesterday's problems instead of preparing for tomorrow's uncertainties. In sport, the team would end up reliving a specific situation that went wrong and preparing precisely what they should have done to make a different outcome happen. But that situation is unlikely, highly unlikely to happen again in that same way. So it's about finding the timeless lessons that can be applied in more general and flexible ways by drilling the fundamentals, really understanding the basics, the simple heart of things, and giving rise to a state of being and an approach to thinking that will then be able to respond to whatever might come next, to adapt to it, to flex with it, and to apply what is there to the situation in front of you. That Lombardi story really resonates with me. How often do we rush towards more strategies or different tools, adding clutter and noise and tactics and, a new program. There's this latest idea that's come through. Okay, I'll try that out. And actually, it's that moment where you need to just pause and clear the clutter, come back to the heart of things. And going back to basics in this sense isn't about simplifying just for the sake of simplicity. Slowing down isn't just slowing down for the sake of slowing down. It's about creating the conditions to return to the core, to see what actually matters, the fundamental truths that anchor, ground, and guide us. Unlearning at the tactical level and relearning at the foundational level. What do I need to let go of so I can actually connect with that football again, so I can actually see that football and understand it when I hold it in my hand? It's like, oh yeah, this is what it's about. And this is a rhythm. Like the football season, I think it's a good example of this kind of seasonal rhythm that we have in all sorts of areas of life, where over time noise builds up and we can lose sense of the fundamentals beneath it all. And so the end of the season and the start of the next one gives us that chance to come back to the fundamentals and to jettison what we don't any longer need to be holding, and to decide what it is that we want to bring to this next season. And this ties to that idea of learning, relearning, and unlearning. It's about holding knowledge and experiences lightly, understanding that what is useful for today might not serve us tomorrow, and it might not be conducive to giving rise to those foundational basics and bringing those things that are important to us and to our projects to life in the future. You know, in a creative context, it's like coming to a new project with a fresh, clean slate. We can trust the fact that, you know, we've accumulated new knowledge, wisdom, and experience. Like this wiping of the slate isn't about sort of emptying our minds and forgetting everything that we know. Actually, we can have faith in the fact that that is there, and that will, you know, we can make use of that in all sorts of different ways. But actually, it's returning to the basics and starting afresh in other ways. Otherwise, we might find pollution from previous endeavors, from previous experiences that don't actually belong here, and they risk contaminating the flow of what comes next. You know, if you bring, okay, that's how we did things before, to the table of what comes next, it might really limit the possibilities for the project in front of you. And this might also apply to certain identity markers. Maybe we've had a role and people are seeing us through the eyes of that role, or there's some symbolic thing that we have picked up along the way about how we're supposed to do things, you know, messages that tell us we can only create using specific mediums, for example, or in a particular genre, things that people have used to describe us, to describe what we've done in the past, which risk imposing an imprisoning expectation on what comes next or the type of creative work we do. Sometimes these limits can be freeing. You know, maybe going back to basics is just reminding myself, okay, what I do is make pop songs that people can sing along to. That's the beginning and the end of it. That's the football. But if the story is, wow, people want me to make pop songs that they can sing along to, and I don't want to be doing that, then I'm not at the basics. That isn't the basics. It's not my basics. And if it's not, what is? Maybe it's, I make art based on things that I find interesting. You know, it can take a while, can't it, to find our basics. But I think it's obvious when we get there. This is something we talked about in our gathering. You know, what does it feel like to get back to basics in this sort of context? And it's like a breath. It's a freeing feeling. You know, it's a sense of relief, like all the fog clears and you're there, you can see it. You can see the thing that matters in front of you. And that can be a really physically freeing feeling when you find that phrase that is the basics. I write pop songs that people can sing along to, whatever that equivalent is for you. That isn't my basics, just to be clear. Otherwise I've failed miserably throughout my entire life. But yeah, unlearning isn't about rejecting the past or saying, you know, I was wrong to have learnt that in the past. It's about acknowledging that, you know, some things, some strategies, some tactics, even some relationships, they were exactly what was needed then, but we don't necessarily need them now. Not everything is permanent. You know, we might have picked up a story about what we need to keep doing in order to be successful, like the pop songs. Perhaps the person made a song based on something they found interesting. You know, their basics was, I create things based on what sort of gets my attention and what I find interesting. So one of those things was a song. They wrote a song and then it resonated with people and became popular. And then there was this message, this noise that built up around it, which was, okay, keep doing that. That's worked really, really well. But what worked? What did it work for? And how are we measuring the idea of something working? And people often get trapped inside their own success because they buy into judgments surrounding it. It might be messages from other people. It might be an internalized thing of like, oh, wow, that worked. That was successful. And it might be that we're measuring what works and what is successful by standards that actually don't mean anything to us, but we've come to adopt for some reason. And then over time, it might dilute the work that we do. It might dilute our spirit. It might take us away from what drove us in the first place, what drove us to that place in the beginning. This kind of reminds me of how traditions and customs often emerge from practical necessity. And over time, often many years, they kind of embed themselves as unquestionable dogma, even in situations where they are no longer useful, or they've outlived their, practical need, their practical necessity. And instead of sort of pausing to reflect, to learn, to relearn, to unlearn, we sort of lose sight of those deeper values and the vision that these practices initially supported. And then these practices become the focus rather than the channel to the thing that actually should be the focus. And this isn't to say that all traditions need to be eroded and that things that outlive their usefulness are meaningless. Actually, I think quite the opposite. Customs and ceremonies often contain lots of things that's it's excessive, it's beyond a utilitarian purpose, and that is what makes it meaningful and beautiful. And they often help us to find home in shared rhythms and create social bonds that are meaningful within particular sort of collectives, communities, and that kind of thing. But when we cling to these at the expense of the values that they were originally meant to serve, or when we enforce them without questioning their relevance, we can find ourselves in a strange tunnel where the ritual becomes the point rather than the thing that takes us to the heart of things, back to basics. The ritual should be what enables us to get back to basics in that sense. And so our relationship with rituals, with traditions, with customs can go through this learning, relearning and unlearning rhythm so that we are ultimately connecting and reconnecting to why we continue to commit ourselves to these things. Dietary laws are a good example of this. Many originated as practical ways to prevent food-borne illnesses in hot climates. Avoiding certain meats that spoil quickly, for example. Sort of just sensible, necessary guidance, really. And today, in places where, refrigeration and modern food safety make those risks minimal, the original necessity may no longer apply. And yet these are still important customs and rituals to observe. And they're often kind of sacred rules as well. Or things like traditions around burial, so burying bodies, having a funeral very quickly. This is present in certain religious customs, where in warm climates this was essential for sort of hygiene and dignity. And now in places with cooler climates and modern preservation methods, the practice still happens as a religious requirement, even though the original context has shifted and that sort of practical aspect is no longer what drives it. Even something as simple as wearing a tie. It's a more kind of mundane thing, but it's practical way to fasten a shirt before buttons existed. And yet today it's still this sort of symbolic marker of professionalism or respect in some contexts, despite serving no practical function in modern clothing. It takes on, yes, a different sense of meaning. And I think the fascinating thing about this is that kind of reconnecting with the origins of these customs can actually make them more meaningful. They remind us of shared histories and values and beliefs and the connection that we have with people across space and time. And there's something nice about being part of something that we know has been practiced through history. And I certainly don't subscribe to this idea that because we've discovered, this came from this practical reason that was very context specific, and it's no longer relevant to the modern world, and is therefore meaningless and should be discarded. I don't think that follows. I don't think that makes any logical sense, because there's something important about our shared rituals. And I think it's naive to think that they are all about magical thinking and belief in the literal substantive nature of them. People looking down their nose at those who partake in particular rituals and, that's not real. And it's like, on the whole, yes, I know this isn't real, but the truth runs deeper than that surface. We might call this the definition of art. It's a fiction that brings people into an encounter with truth. And really why fiction is a much more true medium of writing than non-fiction in that sense. Anyway, back to basics. Yeah, so it's not about rejecting everything that came before. It's about asking whether what we're holding on to is helping or hindering our connection with what's most important, the stuff beneath all of this. It's about stripping away the noise and the clutter, not destroying meaning, but rediscovering it and opening new layers of it. And it's about not over-investing ourselves in the significance of things as being more than they need to be as well. There's a quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes that has long lived with me. I've never forgotten it since I first heard it many, many years ago, which is, I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And so this image of simplicity as something that we arrive at only after kind of grappling with complexity, going through the middle of this sort of complex tangle of stuff, really speaks to me, really resonates. It's the kind of simplicity that we find in great teachers, those often rare people who so thoroughly understand their topic that they can distill it with an elegant simplicity. They can distill it, they can teach it in a way that makes you feel like you understand it. And yeah, I think teaching in this sense, the ultimate test of understanding, do we really understand the topic that we are learning about? Can we explain it with elegant simplicity to somebody else? Can we boil it down to its basics? Can we sort of filter out the stuff that feels really, really important in the complexity of it? But actually, when exposing someone to a new idea, this stuff is irrelevant. And when you really understand something, which parts are like that. So yeah, teaching is a great practice, really, for helping us understand things better, and also showing us how much we understand something. Sort of simplicity that Oliver Wendell Holmes wouldn't give a fig for. I don't know if that was like a currency when he was dealing in simplicity. And yeah, it's kind of like where we know just enough to believe we know it all. It's where the Dunning-Kruger effect comes into play. When someone is ill-equipped with the knowledge and skills in a subject, they're ill-equipped with the knowledge to know what they don't know about it. And so they don't realize that they lack the expertise that they think they have. And, this phenomenon has its uses. I think it's probably quite an important part of sort of living in the world, especially growing up, learning about things. It's really a good defense mechanism against overwhelm. If you realized early on in life how much there is that you don't know and how little you will ever know, then it could be quite sort of depressingly overwhelming. It might sort of stop us in our tracks before we get going. And so that initial overconfidence can be a stepping stone for creativity and for innovation. It can give us the courage to start before we fully grasp all of these things that we don't know about what it is that we're doing. And it's like, if we were aware of that, we'd have never started in the first place. But yes, of course, this same overconfidence can definitely backfire, especially when somebody has power and money and they've decided that power and money is the same as expertise. We've all seen what happens when someone sort of bullishly marches into a situation that they know nothing about, and arrogantly think that they do. They're unprepared for, what is going to happen. And yeah, this, like, when people assume that expertise in one area qualifies them as authorities in unrelated fields. And I guess this sort of brings us back to simplicity on the other side of complexity, being born of humility as well. It's reconciling everything we don't know. It's coming to confront the contradictions at the heart of this, which is, oh yeah, there is so much more to this than I could ever possibly know. So coming back to basics, it's not about tearing things down. It's about the interplay of integration and disintegration. And it's the firm back and soft front of gentleness that we often speak about. You know, returning to the heart of things allows those basics to be part of us, to strengthen our back, to firm it up, to shape our posture as we take up our space in the world. And so these basic truths, the things that matter most, the sound of our personal creative spirit, the experiences that have helped shape us, the future that we want to be part of shaping, these form the foundations that we carry with us. They're the firm back that lets us meet life's unexpected events with a sense of stable flexibility. And with that stable flexibility comes that soft front, the openness to receive what life brings, absorbing, swaying with those external forces, gently redirecting them when needed. And so this softness becomes our filter for opportunities. It becomes this helpful thing that we can channel invitations and possibilities through. You know, what to learn, what to relearn, what to unlearn, what to say yes to, what to pass on, and what to let go, so that we can clearly see what matters. We can clearly see that football again. This is a football. Can we see it? So yes, back to basics. What does it mean to go back when we're only traveling in one direction? If you fancy maybe joining a future phrase maze exploration in the Haven, you can join us. It's $15 a month. You get access to all our online gatherings, the library of member-only resources that's been sort of building since 2014 when we started, and all the community forums as well. You can take a look around free for 28 days. You can sort of gives you a chance to get a sense of whether or not it feels like a good fit for you. And yeah, maybe you just want to support the continued creation of this podcast and the work that I'm doing around all of this. It's the best way to do that. It allows me to keep this and the website completely free of adverts, which is important to me. It's important to the integrity of the stuff that we're exploring, I think. So if you want to just support it, then that's a great way to do that. You'll find a link in the description, or just head to the-haven.co and you can register there. All right, I will be back again soon for another episode of the Gentle Rebel podcast. Until then, do remember that you are an artist. The world needs your art. Now go and make somebody's day. Bye-bye.
So shines a good deed in a weary world.
All the angels in disguise, we can be